what I've set for some objectives for us in this is, first of all, to get familiar with the maps. And we're going to try to do that. Joe will do the best he can with uh, the maps on Wednesdays. And I do believe from reading over the beginning of the book, that it's going to help us in understanding what's going on more in Israel and keep our interest in the book itself, in the study, of this, give us a king. That's the name of it. So we've gone through this and we realize that this is the whole objective of the people in Israel is they want to look like the other nations around them. The one thing is that I see all the time, and when you relate this to the world, as Al said in his lesson, so you relate this to the world, it seems like it's just such a familiar theme to look at this, what's happening, and then you see the same thing over and over and over. It baffles me, but yet it shouldn't, because we repeat the same things over and over. We're going to look at how much we memorize is up to an individual, but I do believe the more we can stay familiar with the times. And in the book there's a list of starting with creation, and of course, the first sin, flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs, all that. The more familiar we keep with that, I think the more it keeps us in tune with where we're at and what's going on in the book. It's amazing, though, to me that even among a lot of the really good scholars that I consider that seem to be good scholars, how much difference there can be sometimes in reasoning. But I do believe that what happens many times when people are writing commentaries and teaching material, they're doing the best they can with what they have at the time. And you definitely can't, I'm not going to recommend any certain commentary or anything like that. I don't know that much about it. But it never ceases to amaze me that these guys can write these books, even these 5 books that the Waldrons wrote together. The amount of research work that goes into that, and I think sometimes I sort of take it for granted. But when you get to it, I'm studying for hours, and then I'm thinking of these guys that are writing commentaries of every book in the Bible, and the amount of research that goes into that and the amount of work that goes into that, I really admire that. I really do. But I don't in any way try to act like a scholar, and I try to make sure I base it on what I feel are good, sound people that have been respected over the years. Okay, so, but I don't go a lot to that. When we discuss the maps, in the beginning of the book, there's a map there of the land and the way it was divided up. And then what we're going to see as we go along is, as we see these different divisions, we realize how small Benjamin is, even in territory, but we realize how small the tribe is as we get into this first part of, looking at the kings. Then the reason the numbers are so small, we just studied about not too long ago in Judges there, and what they had done, and the fact of what happened with Israel with them and trying to punish them, and then they regretted it. It just, the one thing that popped out at me in this study, though, over and over in my mind, I couldn't get away from, and I know I've been guilty of it in my own life. We start reasoning through these things, and then we just go ahead and act. We think it's so urgent at the time that we have to act. But I believe the first thing we want to do is pray to God. Back then, they could go to a priest, they could go to a prophet, but they didn't take that time to do those things. They just used their own judgments. So what we're getting to the point here is where they really want a king. They've made their mind up. They want a king. And God finally says, go ahead. Now, of course, we're going to see here that Samuel, for good reason, I believe, takes it hard. I believe that as we look at this, we're going to see that Samuel not only is feeling rejected himself, okay, but just the, I guess, a little bit of amazement with the people that they should have been able to see this, okay. So when we look at this and we look at this book, and we're going to talk about the United Kingdom in this book. And what do we mean by the United Kingdom? We use that phrase. We memorize these times of the Bible. What do we mean when we're saying the United Kingdom?
So it's the nation of Israel as a whole, with during the reign of Saul and David and Solomon.
Right. So we see this united because all of Israel is together. And then, of course, we know we're going to get into the divided kingdom when it's going to be the 10 tribes and then Judah with Benjamin. But it's amazing how little bit Benjamin is really talked about when there's discussed Judah. So this united kingdom is Saul, David, and Solomon these times. And we're going to talk about that. Then there's an appendices in this book, just like there was in the period of the Judges. And when we get to that, we'll talk about these different books that pertain to this. The wisdom literature, we realize that is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Those are the books that are connected with this. And I think that'll be an interesting part of this too, I hope. I think it will be for me. And I hope I can make it interesting enough for everybody else. So the period is when, this really is appropriate. And then, we'll discuss a little bit in the book about Saul, David, and Solomon. And I think it really sums it up pretty good, because Saul was really somebody that seemed to have everything going for him. I mean, he's really what, the epitome of what you would think a king would look like. And he's very humble in the beginning. He comes out and really even hides when they go to find him. First time when Samuel comes there, even though he knows, but yet he just can't seem to stay on track with God. He loses track very quickly of where he's going or what he's doing, and of course, he gets himself into some serious trouble. But it seems like his actions then become, as he loses his humility, he becomes more self-centered. Okay. David, and this description in this book, I think, is really good. David really did not want to act without God's direction. Now, we know that David made some serious mistakes. And the one thing about this is, and I always reassess this in my own life, in my own thinking, David was a man after God's own heart. Well, how so? David really did not want to take a step. You read his Psalms and you see that he really wanted God's favor and he wanted God's direction. And of course, we know that he forgot that at times. He was a human being. He was not Jesus Christ. And he made some serious mistakes. But I believe the real thing is, in him being a man after God's own heart, is the fact that he wanted God's direction and he would go back to every move that he made. I mean, not only the one with Bathsheba, he made some other mistakes too. But he reassesses himself and he goes back. And we're going to see it over and over where he really wants to be a man after God's own heart. He wants God's direction in what he's doing. Something we can all recommend for ourselves, right? And then Solomon, we're going to see a king who, I mean, he had everything going for him. David David did the war. David did all the hard work. David even had things lined up for him because God wouldn't allow David to make a house. He had everything lined up for Solomon to build this house. And Solomon took all of this wisdom that he had, all the things that David had set up, had things set in order, and he really made a mess out of his life in many ways. But we know that he still was, they said, was the wisest man, God said, wisest man that ever lived. So it goes to show me some things, and I hope it's lessons for all of us as we go along. Even though Saul started out good, and isn't the world full of good starters? I mean, just look at your years and your time as a Christian. How many people could you think of offhand? I'm not going to name them or anything like that. They just started out because it came to my mind, and Scott Long, talked about it last week. Encouragers, and had some encouragers like like you know Scott talked about, but some of those encouragers just couldn't seem to encourage themselves long enough to stay with it. It is so easy to stay in, when we're up and we're feeling good. We get up in the morning and boy, we want to get our feet on the floor. We're feeling great. And, we're ready to roll. We're ready to tackle the world. But it's a time when the things get tough. That's when we have to really have somebody encourage us and encourage ourselves. Keep that up. We have some here. It's encouraging to me to see the steadfastness of you guys. It really is the steadfastness, because that encourages me, and that's what we need. It's good. It's good to have those people that'll raise up. I personally, I want the encourager as the person I can call on, and I can say I can depend on them. I know unless there's some dire circumstances, I'm going to be able to depend on that person. That's what I call real encouragement, and that's what we're going to see, I believe, in David. Saul had a very difficult time with it, very difficult time, and it didn't take him too long to get off track. If we could think about these things as we go along and learn from them, I think there's going to be a great benefit. We want to learn the history of it. We want to learn the book. We want to do all those things. What we want to do as we go along is we want to be able to derive some lessons for us, okay, for as we go along. Comments, questions? So what we're going to try to do is tackle the book, and I'm not going to try to set a definite time frame or anything like that, because then I rush myself. I start losing track of where I'm at, and that's not hard to do. Trust me, at my age. So what we'll try to do is stay on track with it and just do the best we can in learning it. And then on Wednesday, we'll do the best we can with the maps. I'll see what I can do as far as directing, as Joe helps us to get the maps out and get a good idea of what we're doing with those. Okay. They're in your books. And I encourage you, if I could do it, I would, to keep working on filling those maps out. I think it'll help make the interest, but it'll also help, you'd be able to understand more of what's going on. And remember, this is a small land over there that they have, and yet it's going to get, kind of mixed up as time goes on. So those are some of the things that I'd like to accomplish as we go along. Anybody else have anything thing they'd like to say about, starting the book out? Some suggestions, some comments, anything like that?
I have a question about the map.
Okay.
Is that all cities or is it towns like the Bessel, Mi'kmaq and all those?
If you look in the book, did you look at the book yet?
Yeah, I started.
Okay, in the beginning, you see where there's a map of the land. And the way I understand it, that's the way it was when it was mapped out in the beginning, when it was first given to them, okay?
Mhm.
And then as we go along, we're going to see some of those places we're going to fill in. You'll get blank maps as you go on through the book,
Mhm.
okay? And just try it as best you can to, maybe with the things I thought on Wednesday, as we have it on the screen, then if you have questions, you're not sure of, we could ask at the time,
Okay.
okay?
Mhm.
Fair enough?
Yep.
Okay. So we'll do that. And you see the first map is on page 10 on that, and then we'll go from there and we'll fill in the other ones as we go along. And if you have questions on it. Okay?
Mhm.
All right,
Question, Joe.
go ahead.
And this is concerning the maps too. The first one shows how things were laid out for Israel after they came into the land.
Mhm.
The map on page 9 says Israel in the days of King Saul. And it looks like in here you have Phoenicians, Canaanites, Philistia along the coast, Amalekites, Edom to the south, Moab, Ammon, and the Syrians to the north, to the east and the north. Were those areas out, especially after the ocean, were those not under the control of the Israelites?
Right.
So they weren't under their control.
No, that's exactly right.
Supposed to be, but the Jews didn't wipe them out.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, some commentators, I know, Al, you've had more experience in this book than I have, so don't be afraid to step over me. But the way I understand it is, uh, you know, however you want to say it, they stopped, they got lazy, they got tired of seeing people, killed. You can see the difference in the numbers from even if you go back and look at the numbers, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but when Benjamin was first numbered, and then the number when they did these previous sins and then had civil war, the difference in the numbers with them, you could see that that was probably erosion from the fighting. So here's the thing of it that I couldn't help thinking about in this. As God gives the people the command to go in and get the land, I used to be under the assumption, and this was for many years as a Christian, that okay, man, they just went in and God gave it to them. Now he told them he wasn't going to drive them out all at once, but the fact is that he gave them the task. He would help them, but they had to go in there and do it. So they're losing people. And here's the thing of it. As we think of our lives as a Christian and what we would be willing to do to keep our soul as a Christian, now we understand we are not under the type of persecution that some people are in this world, but definitely not like, excuse me, the apostles were in the first century. You don't get out very far, and then you see Herod killing James. And then, well, is that God doing that? No, that's not God. That's sin doing that. But the whole thing is they were supposed to keep going. So I believe that, what you notice there, Mike, is that at this point, they probably should have been farther along, without a doubt.
You see, that's where I've been mistaken assumption for a long time because I thought they controlled the territory all the way to the sea, but
Yeah.
looks at this map, they didn't.
No, they didn't. And pay attention too, as we go along, we're going to see, that's part of I think the benefit of the map that I saw. I didn't put too much emphasis on the maps in the past, but in this book, as I look at it and look, trying to teach it, I believe there's going to be a great benefit in that, just from what you're saying, Mike. we're gonna see, you know, how much of the territory is still in the hands of, and this also answers, to me, part of the reason why we're seeing so much of the canonization of the Israelite people. They're living among this, okay? I mean, just think of our society today, as Al said in his lesson with the technology. To get away from this stuff is impossible. That's it. You can get away from it to a degree. I can go up the mountains, you know, and have a slow signal up there with Jody's place, and I don't play as much with my computer and my phone up there. But the fact is that here you're being bombarded constantly, and of course we find other things to do up there too. You know, we go fishing, we go hiking, we go out sightseeing, things like that. When we're home in front of that tube all the time, or we're in our computer or our phone, we're going to be bombarded with it. So to me, these people were so surrounded with these Canaanites that were still there. Their whole life is just filled with it. So good observation, though.
Yeah. Yeah, jump in a little bit. I think we tend, in America, we tend to think of firmly drawn lines, you know, between Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. But these are, in essence, regions, and they would have initially been described like, you know, from this huge rock to this river, over to this ridge, and so on. When the land was given to the tribes. So that's the first thing. The second thing is very much like the American Indians. They were constantly, many of them were on the move with these Ammonites and Moabites in particular, to try to capture better land. Remember, a lot of this is desert. And even where there's a river, sometimes that river would completely dry up, you know, during hot times.
Yeah.
So the area, for example, up north, east and south of the Sea of Galilee was extremely fertile, and it was watered, you know, with snow from the mountains and so on, and a lot of natural springs. So that was very coveted land. So like the American Indians, you know, you could say Chickasaws were in Oklahoma, but they would also go into North Texas.
Mhm.
They would go into West Arkansas. They would go, you know, they would fight each other, and then they would settle on the land. And then 100 years later, the Cherokees would have the land that used to be owned by the Chickasaws. It's a lot like.
Mhm.
So this first map, you know, gives us in essence the areas that the tribe settled in. But then that second map is as much as 350 to 400 years later, after the period of Judges. And so it's kind of a snapshot of what things look like, you know, at the time of Saul. We know, for example, the Danites originally settled down south of Joppa and just north on the coastline. But remember, they moved north, I think, probably to find better land and also be more or less isolated from their enemies. So that's just an example of migration within the areas of Israel. And again, I think another thing helpful, it's 120 miles from the south part of Israel up to the north part. So in these areas, you could walk them in, you know, a relatively small number of days.
Yeah.
And so there's constant fighting, constant migration, seeking the better farmland and so on. And then the Ammonites occasionally making really raids, again, like the Indians, cross the river, and they would hold cities and areas for a certain period of time. And then, you know, during the period of Judges, Jephthah or, others would come in as judges, defeat the Ammonites for a while, gain the land back, and then have peace for 34 years.
Right.
So it's a very fluid situation rather than hard,
Right.
you know, concrete lines.
Good point. Yeah. People keep those things in mind as we go along too.
So it's really kind of good to ask Okay, when Saul was living, what was the situation?
Right.
The Philistines still very strong. They held those 5 cities along the coast and, were thorn into, Saul's side. And he was fighting the Philistines on the day he died. He fell on the sword.
Right. That's what we're gonna see too. I'm gonna ask Sandy, I'm gonna read some of this, so as we go through these, because it helps me stay on target. And then you understand where I'm at, what I'm talking about. In chapter 8, Sam, can you read verses 1 through 9?
What, First Samuel?
1 Samuel 8, yes, 1 through 9.
And it came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, and they were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Then listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them, and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them.
So this really, it to me tells me a whole lot as I read these scriptures. Samuel is doing all that he possibly can. Samuel is a good man. There's no doubt about this. He is an example of a good, godly man. But then he has these sons. Doesn't seem like they're as bad as Eli's sons by any means. But yet here's a good man who has these sons that have gone astray. They're taking bribes, okay? And the people they see this. But here's the thing about this. Now, God predicted this. We know this. We'll go back to that in a little bit. But they didn't go and say, ask God about this, tell God, what our problems are. They said, we want a king. We want to be just like them. And the thing is that what they're doing in this passage too tells us that they were still worshiping these other gods. They just go back to them. And they go back to them over and over. We're going to see even in the divided kingdom, we're going to see constantly that they go over and over them. They go back to them until they're taken to Babylon. But that's another day. Okay. So Samuel's disturbed. He's bothered. He probably takes it somewhat personally. He's done everything, and we'll see that in chapter 12. That's one of the reasons I put chapter 12 in on this sheet too. We're going to see the heart of Samuel in that. But right now, what he's doing is he goes to God, and God says, "No, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me." That again tells me that Samuel was doing God's will. He was doing what it's nothing that God says to Samuel, well, if you'd have done this or if you'd have done that. Don't we all go through that guessing game when we do things wrong and things happen to our lives? He didn't go through the guessing game. He went to God. And God said, no, it's not you. He said, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And that's the thing that we've got to be very careful of in our life as we study the Word of God. That's why we stay in it. That's why we have a desire, why we should have that desire, like Al talked about, of wanting to be in God's Word and wanting to know His will. So go ahead.
You know, Joe, that just made me think of that, Samuel's sons being as corrupt as they were. It goes back to, like you said, the judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That just tells me that the priesthood itself must have been full of corruption
Mhm.
and whatnot. Otherwise, it's hard for me to believe that. I could believe that one son might go bad, but for multiple sons to go bad like that,
Mhm.
it must have been considered not bad what they were doing, or they wouldn't have done it. Maybe one, but it's hard for me to believe both. So it must have been a whole lot of corruption going on at that time. Even though Samuel himself was good, it was considered acceptable to do some of the things they were doing, or I don't think they were doing.
Right. I agree with you. And I think it shows me anyway, it tells me, and I think I'm wrong, don't be afraid to say so, I've been wrong before. But it was probably what the rest of the people probably considered the norm. You know, that this is the way we do things. Isn't it that let's not get into politics. I mean, I'll try not to get into it or anything like that. But the fact is, it's hard to ignore it in our society and in the world in general, but in our society. The one thing that, I love these Western books. I'm reading books about the mountain men and stuff like that. And like what Al was talking about, the way the Indians divided up the land and they fought over it, changed borders and changed uh, back, their loyalties and things like that. But the fact is, that was the norm. That's the way they survived, I guess. Now, I'm not justifying what Samuel's sons did because it was wrong. And God said it. And he said, okay, so now the whole society, I believe, is probably, like Mike said, corrupted by this. So God's going to go ahead and give them a king, and let's see what happens with that, right? I think most of us have been into this a little bit before, so we have some good ideas, but we'll see what we can learn on that. Any other questions or comments up to that point? Okay. I'm going to have Al, can you read verses 10 through 22?
Yes.
And I'm just going to cover through chapter 8, and then we'll call it a class.
You're still in chapter 8. Right?
Yes, 10 through 22.
So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. And he said, "This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. And he will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day."
So here's the thing. This is what you want. This is what you're going to get. I'm afraid that, many times we get what we ask for. We're not so sure that that's what we should have asked for, right? But as a society, you can see it very plainly. It's a little more difficult to see it in our life. So each one of these individuals that Samuel's talking to, I believe, has to take some responsibility for this. We can always say there's the, the silent majority, the quiet few, the ones that don't. But it seems to me that if the overall majority did not want a king, it probably would have come out in some way. There would have been some kind of, disagreements there, would have been discussed. And wait a minute, maybe is this what we really want? Samuel's telling you, but they're not seeing it. They say, no, this is what we want. This is what we need, kings just like the rest of the nations around us have. I don't know whether, and again, this is conjecture. And of course, in that way, I could be a commentary writer, right? With conjecture. But was this the fact that they just couldn't see it in the other nations, that there was problems there too? Or was it that the grass always looks greener on the other side? And maybe they weren't involved as closely as they could have been, or understanding what was going on in these other nations.
I think it's kind of like it is today. Even we don't know what goes on in Canada. I mean, and they're right next door to us.
Yeah,
Much less in Europe and what, how they do their stuff over there. I mean, one of the things they always talk about is the cost of drugs being cheaper elsewhere. Well, how would we know that? We don't really talk to those folks that much. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's like,
no,
they wouldn't know. They just got this picture in their head of how grand it's gonna be,
right.
and they really don't know.
They don't know. Exactly right. And when you go there, you see some things that are going on that you wouldn't want to be going on in this nation, when you get a little closer and see some of that. But yet there's always, it seems like, oh, there's less crime in some of their cities and stuff like that. That very well could be.
Joe,
Yeah,
interesting analogy. You asked how this can happen. In the Revolutionary War period, we remember people like Sam Adams and John Hancock and others that were really firebrands. But at no time during the entire 8 years, really, the Revolutionary War, did more than a third of the Americans actually support the Revolutionary cause. A full third supported England, and many of them went up back to Europe. And then a third were just kind of in the middle, trying to survive and, go with the flow and farm their farms and so on. But the issue was the third of true believers, the patriots, were so powerful in their voice that they actually moved us into war with Britain. And after 8 really tough years, they won. So what I'm saying is the vocal minority, once it reaches a critical mass, can move the entire nation, and we see that throughout history. I think you see it in this country right now. I mean, we have a vocal minority who want things like free LGBT rights and gender fluidity, and things that I would consider abortion. In the 9th month, and some have even advocated killing the baby after the baby is born. I mean, that is barbarous. But there's a vocal minority of people, thank goodness, of people who advocate those kinds of things. So here in Israel, did every Israelite want a king? I doubt it.
I doubt it.
But you had the elders, and you had a vocal minority of people that said, yeah, we want the king, we want it to be like everybody else. And they carried the day, so to speak, just like in the revolution.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to see. And God's going to give them what they ask for. And that's one thing that I really do evaluate my prayers as I go along, to try to get what I want for other people and ask, but it has to be thy will be done, right? The original prayer that Jesus taught his disciples, thy kingdom come and thy will be done. I'm going to go ahead and close in prayer, and Wednesday night we'll pick up and we'll see what we can do with the maps a little bit, Joe, if you can get some of them up for us. And I'll work on what we want to do is try to get a picture of it. Everybody can help in that matter, probably.